Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be talking to you about food crisis and how you can minimize the damage to your brand reputation, to your organization, and to your financials of your company. We're seeing, or I should say, the presentation that I'll be doing today will include information as a result of a pan-European EU-funded project under the 7th platform of funding, where we looked at the whole area of how organizations could use social media for both the benefit and also the risks, food risks. This presentation will focus more on the risk management side, but as we heard from the earlier speakers, there is a tremendous opportunity for organizations to be using social media proactively to talk about the issues and challenges the industry faces going forward. Because quite frankly, if you don't take the mass of the consumer with you, they will think that you are creating Frankenstein foods and you are chasing food quality down to the lowest cost. So what we'll talk about really is starting first with where social media started. Some of you will recognize this picture, some won't. This is the 20th anniversary of the first model of what became today's smartphones. This is the Nokia 9000. It is also the 10th anniversary this year, so 2006 saw the explosion of social media. We've had reference to Facebook and Twitter. Both of those tools became mainstream starting in 2006. And we've seen a veritable explosion of platforms that people can use to share content, to communicate with online communities. And there are dozens of new products launched at all times. Without doubt, as we heard from the earlier speaker, 1.7 billion people connected on Facebook alone. That is a massive marketing communication opportunity. It's also a risk if we have a food crisis to face. How are we using these tools? This is a typical picture of people taken about a year ago commuting to work. You will notice they are not reading paper-based materials. Majority of people now use their smartphones, I'm sure it's true for yourselves, to receive news and information. Your own network of contacts, as well as traditional news outlets, as well as online banking. Our world increasingly revolves around online data and cloud-based information being supplied to us. What we're actually finding, though, from research, recent research, is in fact 1/3 of people who wake up at night do the first thing, which is pick up their smartphone and check for messages. 1/3 of those people actually then participate in social media before they go back to sleep, or they answer some company emails. They're basically seeing our working time stretch almost throughout the day. We're also seeing the working day or the working week not be just simply Monday to Friday. That has a critical implication to us if we're monitoring what is being said about our company and our brand, or our competitors in the industry, or about the industry generally, because if we're not monitoring what is happening, we run the risk of a social media crisis outside of normal working hours. What are people saying about this compulsion of people to actually participate in social media? Behavioral psychologists have coined a phrase called FOMO, fear of missing out, FOMO. And it's almost like a psychological need for people to be part of a community. It's, after all, what makes us human beings. So therefore, social media, it's almost like a demand to do it. How many times have you been out in a restaurant or a particular social gathering and people are not so much chatting to themselves, but they're texting or reading their emails or doing activities? It's part of our daily lives. One challenge we have to take into account is there is a generation now coming into the employment our employment who have known nothing except social media. I'm not that generation. I've had to try and catch up by watching my grandchildren and how they're currently using it. So people that we're hiring today, not only as consumers but employees, have grown up using this material, engaged in integrating it inside their lives, in effect. What do we use social media for? Well, there's a lot of content out there which is happy, fluffy animals. That always goes down well. And maybe from David, some of the packaging could have some of this material on for success. It is always very popular. But there's also sometimes a challenge when you've got these devices. Your child has been taken to the zoo, an animal starts to eat it. Do you take a picture and post it on Twitter, or do you rescue your child? I don't know the answer, but sometimes those challenges face us. But there is a serious side to how people can use social media. It has been used to help communities get together that maybe they've not had that opportunity to use traditional media or traditional ways of communicating. It's also seeing rapid use in terms of emergencies and accidents. This is an actual photograph of a tragic plane accident. You can actually see somebody having evacuated the plane has taken a picture and then has actually posted it on Twitter. It was actually done so quickly that the world knew about the incident literally before the emergency trucks arrived to try and put out the fire on the aircraft. Imagine now you were the PR manager or the communications manager at that airport. You started to receive telephone calls from the media, traditional media, asking you about the incident. There's a good chance you didn't even know it had happened yet. That's how impactful. There was the speed mentioned by Eric in his presentation. Speed is at the heart of social media. But we also use it for things like TripAdvisor, or wisdom of the crowds, as it's called about, where we'll use products such as TripAdvisor to help us plan our activities. So the wisdom and the collaboration of information can work for good as well as negative. One thing to note is we've talked about food, we've talked about socialization. Food is one of the most important topics when it comes to social media. It's the one that people will tweet about, post information on Instagram, post information on Facebook. So the industry, the food industry, farm to fork, we've heard it's not just millennials, it's everybody. We all need to eat. It's a social context. It's an opportunity to talk. So we're in an industry that is very much talked about by people using social media. The food risk information, I don't have enough time to go through the project. It was 3 years in length, included over a dozen research establishments across Europe. And it was really to understand how people were using it. It ran from, I should have said, sorry, from 2010 to 2013. And it was to really understand how the European consumer was using social media and online communities to obtain information, both on terms of the benefit for food, but also the crises. Our task was very much to look at what had happened, to look at tools, and we used as a base reference the dioxin contamination that happened in the pork side of the food industry in Ireland. And we had to look at over 100 possible platforms that allowed us to do data, extract data in real time as to what was going to be said about a future crisis. But we used this crisis as a way of prototyping the tool that we needed and the analytics that we need to apply to really, in effect, provide a mission control capability for the researchers to see what was happening within social media when a crisis was happening. Using information supplied by the Food Safety Authority in Ireland, they found out that Germany was one of their biggest markets for pork. They actually tracked where Germany had imported Irish pork from. And as you can see, it was quite a few countries, not just directly from Ireland itself. They then wanted to know who had exported pork across Europe, or where Germany had exported the pork to. And as you can see from this slide, it starts to get very complex. And in some cases, the product never left or went through Germany. It went straight from Ireland through to Russia in this case. The issue that I'm sharing these slides with you about is that food is has a complex distribution chain. So consumers don't understand it. What they do understand when a problem occurs is this. They're faced with the product being stripped off the shelves, and there is it any wonder that they're concerned about what is happening and why. And if they're not getting that information from official sources, they will worry themselves and post information online. They will go and search for that data. And what we found very clearly was when we look back at 2010, by using Google search as just a generic term of Irish pork, 2 years after the incident, 3 of the top 5 search results that you get from Google was about the negative issue. It mentioned the Irish dioxin crisis. Today, if you looked online and entered those words, you would see that there is no mention of the dioxin crisis. But in fact, the last mention of it dropped out in the top 10 listing in 2014. That is 6 years after the incident, and there is still bad news being shown on Google. And most of the postings that came up were social media information. So important that you realize it can have a long-term negative impact on your brand reputation. And what you need to be doing there effectively is getting in with your message quickly. And some case studies I'll show you in a minute will actually explain how important that is. Now, the command mission control desktop that we created was based on a commercially available product. And what we wanted to do is be able to track who was saying what about the incident, the issue, and actually analyze that information and provide it in a format that we could then actually use for future food crises. So we looked at the product. It was called Radian6. It's actually a Canadian company that produced it. We wanted on the left-hand side, as you can see, the keyword search, i.e. the content analysis. What were people actually saying? So this was us tracking what would become hundreds of thousands of posts over the length of the incident in multiple European languages. So we had to code the particular keywords and translate them to be able to track them from the content that was being produced. On the right-hand side, you can see that we wanted to understand whether or not there were comments being made that were different in different social media platforms or not. We weren't sure in 2008 or 2010 as we produced this tool to be able to monitor what was being said, whether we'd actually ever have a crisis. In fact, tragically, we had 3 major food crises in Europe over the next 3 years. We had the 2010 dioxin contamination that affected pork from Germany and actually poultry. We had the EHEC E. coli contamination in sprouted seeds. And then we had the horse meat, which wasn't a crisis in terms of a food contamination, but more, as was mentioned by David, an adulteration of beef by lower-priced horse meat. That was purely a financial gain that caused problems in that particular instance. We were looking and working with the European Food Safety Authority, and we used the RASAF, which is the early alert system for feed and food. And from that, we were able to get ready and understand that there was going to be an issue. We could understand which countries, what languages we needed to work on, and actually deploy the system to start monitoring what was happening. This is an example of a graph that was produced. It's actually for the EHEC E. coli incident. We were tracking millions upon millions of data, tweets, posts, blogs, Facebook group postings. It was a long period because if you remember, there were some false identifications of the potential contaminant foodstuffs. So there were constant reiteration of the issues and concerns of consumers. And we were tracking those literally on an hourly basis to find out what was happening, who was saying what, and where and why. The objective being, could we get an insight that would help the food industry be able to track what was happening? What we found was, generally, all countries across Europe used the same platforms, but not in exactly the same way. So, for example, Twitter was more important in the UK and the Nordic. Focus groups and other groups were more important in the Spanish and French and Belgian markets, but basically all the same platforms that you'll know and be aware of were used across Europe. We did find Twitter was more used simply because of the type of product it was, to actually just provide the fact that there was an incident occurring without too much reference. Facebook, very important because there are groups, special interest groups on there. So basically, one posting to that special interest group could get thousands and thousands of people notified of information. Facebook has recently released news as a function, so therefore it's, in a way, competing with Twitter. We also found online news, very interesting ways that were played with synergy backwards and forwards, and I'll explain that in more detail in a minute. And blogs, slightly slower, but much more information, as happened with forums. The bottom line is, everything up there has an important role and needs to be tracked, and I would argue, answered and responded to before consumers get themselves into a position where fear and uncertainty leads them to make a decision to stop purchasing a product. The horsemeat crisis was different. It affected many European countries, but wasn't entirely a food risk. Remember, some European countries eat horse meat. In my country, horses are pets. You wouldn't eat them. So the horsemeat crisis in Europe had different connotations in terms of how big an issue it was. But in the UK, because we don't normally expect when you're buying a beef burger to also have horse meat, the reaction was quite significant, a very significant drop in sales. Not helped because, although it was very jokey to begin with, people were laughing about it, saying, I feel I have to gallop. It's what a horse does. I feel I have to gallop to go and have something, grab a bite to eat from Tesco's, who were one of those retailers that had issues, that had food that had been adulterated. It worked well, and the humor continued until, unfortunately, Tesco made one of the mistakes of playing on a joke. Here you can see, so we're off to hit the hay, meaning we're going to sleep. It's a term in England. You can hit the sack or hit the hay when you go to bed. So Tesco's was laughing, and the consumers did not like that, because they can laugh, but the retailer who's been the cause of it cannot join in the joke. And the result was that within a short period of time, Tesco's were lined up and people were moving away from it as a retailer and stopping buying the products generally. Interestingly enough, referring to what David said, you can see very clearly here, this was actually research done by Mintel just before the horse incident, horse contamination in December 12, through to March 2013. You can see that traceability, closed supply loops, those manufacturers or retailers that had certified farms rather than buying in bulk from brokers, were actually rewarded. People were, in a time of issue and crisis, they will fall back to the suppliers that they think have a better control on ingredients, manufacturing, and inspection. Two companies, I'm often asked whether or not this issue that I keep talking about, brand reputation, applies to people who supply in the ingredient marketplace. I want to share with you very quickly two companies that actually you've probably never heard of. Those of you in America possibly have. BPI and AFA Foods. What they do is actually very good from food waste point of view. They have a way and a process of actually taking off the trimmings from beef and actually saving those trimmings that would normally be thrown away. And it's called boneless lean beef trimmings or lean finely textured beef. It's legal, it's perfectly safe, and in the US, they were allowed, manufacturers and processors were allowed to add 25% of this filling or the trimmings to pure ground beef. What happened was that traditional media were not happy that these trimmings were being used in this product and called it pink slime. Now, that's a derogatory term. Pink was because of the pink nature of the colorant, the materials that had been recovered, basically, in the process, and the slime because the fine texture didn't feel like normal meat. And basically, traditional media ran exposés on this. The company actually did a very good job of putting their PR and senior management to do plant tours, to talk to governors, to take to senior politicians, all with the objective of having done massive press tours of the plant, of getting good coverage. And of course, that's what they did. They actually got some of the politicians to eat the hamburger, or beef burger at the time. And generally, they pushed back, saying, this is unfair. But what the companies BPI and AFA Foods hadn't actually realized that there was a parallel world called social media. And a well-known American blogger of food took issue with this and didn't feel it was right her children were being fed this pink slime. So what she did is she started a petition, an online petition. When it got to about 100,000 people signing up for the petition, traditional news got interested in interviewing her. That drove the petition, her online petition, even further. So you can see the synergy between traditional media and social media. What happened was that when that reached 250,000, lots of other bloggers, other people interested in the food industry, as well as probably some activists, also started doing local campaigns. They approached local retailers, asked them what they were doing, approached other organizations, purchasing organizations. The net result was this: very public, that the companies didn't exist, they didn't supply visibly to consumers, but basically because the retailers and other people were feeling the pressure of consumers' protests and withdrew and said, we don't supply it, the two companies found that their businesses, which were worth billions of dollars and had thousands of employees, literally crashed in less than a week. And they're on record to say that they lost something like 60% of their orders over one terrible weekend. This is now coming to trial next year because the company is suing traditional broadcasters for basically raising the issue in their programs. So the important thing is to note, time is critical. Speed in social media. If you think traditional media works well, social media, you can get a mob arising very, very quickly. So what are the things practically you can do? All of you who are not yet participating in social media need to participate and actually create your own friends, fans to follow you, because they will help you defend you going forward. You also need to ensure that you plan organizational responsibilities. Time and time again, I've seen organizations fall foul of the fact that they're spending time planning when a crisis is in progress. You don't have the time to do that. It will move too fast for you. You also need to look at pre-auditing likely issues. I'm sure you all, as an organization, will know where you're likely to have problems going forward in terms of third-party suppliers or processes. Don't be caught out trying to find out what the issue is and why it's occurred if you already have some knowledge and information on it. And basically, finally, what you need to be doing is also prepare your responses and understand what you need to be doing. So here are 3 quick do's and 3 quick don'ts. Don't try and pretend there isn't an issue. If there is an issue, acknowledge it and own it. Take leadership. Explain what you're doing as a company in as much as you can, but silence does your argument no good. Provide clear advice and guidance. If in a silence, people will go and find any information they can, even false information, incorrect information. So you as the source should be providing that information and updating it. And it needs to be updated regularly and be consistent, and from yourself, managed and communicated. So your social media strategy should be working towards building a group of people who are already fans and followers, but also using it actively. What you mustn't do is actually blame others, because people think that's avoiding things. You're trying to hide away. And beware of delegating to junior staff. Make sure that this is owned by the most senior people in your organization, because it could be the future of your organization going forward. And finally, legal must be involved, but don't leave it to legal, because they will tend to work at a pace that's usually fast for legal, and it's snail-paced as far as social media is concerned. More information can be found on the Food Risk Project. We produced a document that people could use and reference, so there's guidebooks, information, best practice data on there. And finally, just to reinforce what David said about owning the message and taking that information out here, these are farmers in America that are proactively using social media to help educate consumers and explain to them how much they care about the food industry, and they are eating what they produce. We'll just have a quick look at the video, 30 seconds, and then I'll finish. Thank you very much indeed.